Welcome to our podcast series, Raising Saints and Forming Scholars, where we delve into your questions about the world of classical education. We were made for truth, beauty, and goodness. Let's talk about it. This episode is sponsored by 2M Express Incorporated, a New Mexico-based trucking company hauling anything from construction materials to food products. For more information, call 505-480-3339. That's 505-480-3339. Would you like to sponsor a future episode of Raising Saints and Forming Scholars? Then consider becoming a gala sponsor for Holy Child Catholic School by clicking on the link in our show notes or going to our website for more information. Hello, this is Principal Martinez, and you're about to listen to a podcast about fairy tales. When you listen to our podcast, you'll notice we bring up Sleeping Beauty, but actually, this podcast is about Beauty and the Beast. You'll also notice that there are 2 introductions to the topic of Beauty and the Beast. Now, why did we have such technical difficulties, you might wonder? Well, this is a good opportunity for me to point out that my assistant and I, Mrs. J.R.R, are making podcasts in the middle of running a school, and we're always on a tight deadline. We really want to get out this podcast before Fairy Tale Friday, and honestly, before Mrs. J.R.R gives birth, which is a great reminder to all of us that it can be very tricky to make podcasts while also running a school, as there are only so many hours in the day. Would you like to help us with our podcasts? If you're interested, please go to the show notes and email Mrs. J.R.R or I and see if there's any way God is calling you to assist us in this worthy goal of spreading the good news about a Catholic classical curriculum. Thank you for your consideration. Listen to our podcast to learn about how fairy stories are a mirror to this world and helps us avoid raising what some scholars are calling the autonomous child. Are our American adaptations of fairy tales the best way to cultivate virtue in children, or is there a value to returning to the original stories? And how does the story of the gospel break into our own world and through fairy stories to the lives of children? Join us as we discuss these and other topics connected to cultivating virtues and building the moral imagination of children in a Catholic classical school. Welcome to Raising Saints and Forming Scholars. Today, we're going to be talking about forming a child's moral imagination, and in particular, fairy tales. But I'm just so thrilled to have 2 wonderful guests with me, Mr. and Mrs. Talley, who are teaching with us this year at Holy Child Catholic School. And I want to mention that Mr. Talley received his formation at the Pontifical College Josephinum, and Mrs. Talley has wonderful formation from Benedictine University and the Augustine Institute. And I've noticed in my conversations with them, they're bringing that wealth of education and training to their teaching, to the classroom. So I thought they would have some wonderful things to share with us about forming a child's imagination. And I actually want to start with me in my old age trying to get good formation. I'm in the master's program at the University of Dallas, and a professor there, Dr. Eidt, E-I-D-T, just kind of wanted to share what she has to say about fairy tales, because she actually wrote a book about German fairy tales. She's German. And she mentions how children in schools today, not in our school, but in other schools, read from reader books that are just plain silly, that do not have significant topics, and that avoid, quote, the unsettling elements of life. We know real fairy tales can be very unsettling. They're not Hollywood, they're not cute, but she says we should not be avoiding that. And I thought this was something really interesting. She said if you go to the original fairy tales, they have events and stories that have patterns of repetition. Many things happen in 3, many things happen in 7. Of course, we're going to think of the Trinity or the the 7 vices, the 7 virtues, the 7 deadly sins. So she says all this repetition is lost in American versions. When American writers retell those fairy tales, they leave out the structure of the story and how much that would bring to bear on the conversation with children. So I just kind of am opening up our conversation with that.
Absolutely. So there's something, and we'll speak about one fairy tale in particular that Dylan noted to me last night. There's a portion when, who's the writer who rewrote Sleeping Beauty?
The first version is by an author named Villeneuve, and it is the original written version of Beauty and the Beast. The second one is by an author named Beaumont, who took Villeneuve's original version, pared it down, and left out some essential details.
Well, this pared down version, they leave something out because it may have been uncomfortable, and it takes away something crucial about one of the characters.
Does it?
That I guess we'll
Can you share with us what it is?
Are we going great now?
Yeah, so are you talking about...
In the first version of Beauty and the Beast by Villeneuve, the prince is transformed into a beast by an enchantress, evil fairy, who is put in charge of him because of the death of his parents. When he's an adult, she makes advances on him and he refuses her, because of which the evil fairy transforms him into a beast. In Beaumont's version, the prince is turned into a beast because he refuses lodging to an enchantress passing through. In the first version, it is very clear that the prince is virtuous. He refuses the enchantress's advances because he is chaste. He is changed into a beast not despite his virtue, but because of his virtue. In the second version, it appears that the prince is turned into a beast because of his vice, because he refuses to give shelter to the enchantress.
That's a great point. It takes virtue to see virtue. We don't always see that reproduced in these retellings.
Yeah.
In discussing virtue and names that might be difficult to say, we were really excited about this book by vegan Guroian, Tending the Heart of Virtue. And he taught at Loyola College and University of Virginia. He has so much to say about what we're doing wrong with young people nowadays, how we can train students better. And so I thought it might be interesting to bring up some of his points. He mentions schools in America today have a softness, a relativism that brings a certain, he calls it the autonomous child. We're training children to not have a connection with our Western civilization, with what a virtue is or isn't, that they're just sort of floating out there. There's no truth. There's relativism, and there's softness. Because schools are so concerned with, are we safe? Is it relevant? So he says we're asking those questions at our peril because we're not showing students the importance of being virtuous. And of course, we learn virtue through the intellect, through school instruction, but a lot of that is going to come through stories that will impact children. So tell us something you want to share. Maybe you can show us this book.
Sure. So
we're looking at books.
It's interesting. This author also mentions the Tending the Heart of Virtue in his section that I wanted to mention about.
Yes.
What is the moral imagination, and what are we trying to do with fairy tales, particularly in the classroom? And I think there's going to be 2 levels we're going to speak about. So definitely tending the heart of virtue in the child and developing that through stories, but also I want to speak about how stories, fairy tales themselves, speak to the human heart because of the greatest story. So
I love how you say that.
Yeah,
I love how you say that.
This book is Awakening Wonder. It's a classical guide to truth, goodness, and beauty. And then the author you've mentioned,
Stephen Turley.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So he, this book in particular, it goes into the broad, the history of why classical thought holds in highest form truth, goodness, and beauty. And I wanted to go to the section. He has a section on the moral imagination. And I'm going to read just this little piece here that I think will give us kind of like a guidebook for like what is the moral imagination, and how do we enrich it in the child, and for what purpose, I guess. So he says here, the imagination has been given to humans by God to perceive the divinely infused meaning of the cosmos, which provides a moral map of the world by which we might live. And so when we think of the imagination of the child and developing it through story, I think that's one level is, how might I be a human? How might I, like, what is the way to be truly free through story? And what his suggestion is, he uses particularly, he didn't use this term, but he talks about typology in scripture. So that, for instance, an Old Testament figure foreshadowing and showing us who Christ is to be, and I guess
Mary is the new Eve.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
We study typology here with our scripture students.
Excellent. So that's the thing. So he says here, the Christian meta narrative, from creation to consummation, from the primeval Adam to the new Adam, provided an alternative cosmic narrative to those of the classical world by which the totality of life could be understood. So I think when we're talking about this moral imagination, we can speak of how the scriptures can show us what it means to be man, and then from there there's like this springboard for how we are to live.
You know, you're making me think, last year when I taught literature, that was in my syllabus, what you're saying, that we take time at a school to look at words because of the word, the logos, right? It all originates with God, the word. And like you said, we have the meta narrative of salvation history. So when you come to school and you read stories, the child should be given an opportunity to glimpse that, right? It should be like a mirror reflecting back and forth. Unfortunately, nowadays in your local public library, most of the books there will do just the opposite. And so at our school, we take time with intention. What stories are the children going to read? You know, so I love that quote.
And going back to, so I brought here.
I'm so glad.
This book is, it's a little worn.
I was going to say it looks worn, which is good.
So this is interesting, and maybe this is where we can segue into Tolkien's vision for what makes a fairy tale. But this book was given to me by my Nana. I was a struggling reader, and she taught me to read. She bought me this book of fairy tales, and I wanted to ask myself, what is it about fairy tales that move the human heart? Like, and not just children. I mean, my children bring me books to read, and there's some books I'm like, oh, this one again, you know, and sure. But I never mind when they bring me, for instance, Rapunzel. I'm like, why couldn't I read this for the 90th time this year alone? You know, what is it in fairy tales that speaks even to me? So
yeah, and I think what my wife is moving towards is Tolkien's meditation on children as they relate to fairy stories. And what he says is that fairy stories are not particularly for children. And in fact, he would hold that great literature is as well for children as it is for adults. Children are not this other species. for which we have to write special literature.
Please no.
Yes.
They enjoy fairy stories because they are good literature, and he has some ideas about what makes fairy stories good, which we can also talk about.
Please.
In Tolkien's schema, there's the writer of a fairy story is a sub-creator, someone who takes from the primary world and creates a secondary world. And this secondary world is a believable alternate universe to which we can bring true belief, literary belief. And in that world, truths about the primary world are made manifest to the reader. So truths about the human person, about virtue, about goodness, about evil, about the abuse of power, onward and so forth. All of this happens in fairy stories. So good fairy stories are a kind of a mirror to this world that allows us to see this world clearly.
Yeah, I think I love how you mentioned sub-creator. It's so funny. I have that Tolkien book in my office. I used to read that essay with my high schoolers. And when we say sub-creator, we're reminding ourselves we're not the boss, right? Where God has He's the creator. We're trying to develop humility to work with Him, which goes back to my point, or to Dr. Eit's point, that we're raising the autonomous child in a lot of our schools. We don't want to do that. If we could let kids know our creativity is something we do hand in hand with God, I think they would have that peace and that humility to let the Lord show them who they are. Because I think in our culture, the message to young people is you got to figure out your identity, and it's about power, and you've got to develop it and show it and fight for it, rather than let's receive it. What does the Lord have in store for us? That Marian receptivity, I think, would help so much with the bad things that the society is telling our young people.
And maybe this is where we can be a little bit more mindful as adults, because I think unfortunately some adaptations of fairy tales seek to bring about that.
Oh, yes.
And whereas when we look at others, we get a different glimpse. I'll give a tiny example. For instance, The Little Mermaid, the most recent film adaptation that all the children know.
Change the original.
Yes,
right?
So the idea is that what does the current culture hold in value is independence and passion and doing what feels good, right?
At the moment.
Yeah, at the moment. Whereas in the original version, I don't know, maybe this is why they changed it. The Little Mermaid,
yes,
she becomes sea foam because
know.
she didn't obey her father. And obedience, there's a reason why obedience was held in such high esteem when it was created. And in my classroom, for instance, I didn't think too much about, yesterday we listed all the fairy tales we've read so far, and right away both classes mentioned Hansel and Gretel. And I was thinking this morning, like, why was that so shocking to them that they'd remember Hansel and Gretel? And you see how the children, they were learning fortitude, which is being strong in the face of trials, where they were strong, and then at the end they're reunited to their loving father who loves them dearly, right? So there is a way, although Tolkien, which you'll talk a little more about, he's making me a little softer about even the fairy tales that aren't perfect.
Yes.
Because of, Dylan, maybe you could share a little bit, because you articulate it so well, and I could read from the epilogue, because of what story does for the human. Do you want me to explain? Right, you were saying that.
Yeah, what are you referring to exactly?
And I don't want to say it incorrectly, but that all the things that make a fairy tale and make a good fairy tale all exist in the gospel, and yet the gospel breaks through history and is true.
I think you said that really well.
Yeah.
But he was the one who brought it up.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess in Tolkien's terms, I don't know if we have to read this whole thing, but
No, just
but in Tolkien's terms, it's the gospel contains contains a fairy tale. In other words, there's a secondary world created within the gospel that, because it is historically true, breaks into the primary world.
Yes. And imagine if we could get kids to really believe that and not lose their faith. Yeah. Okay, so just for I've taught little kids, follow them on to high school, and the cynicism from the world breaks in and they lose their faith.
Which I think is why these stories are so essential.
Yes.
When, I mean, I get maybe they were never primarily intended, but there's this deep, how do you say, desire for fairy tales, even in children.
Yes.
And if we can take those moments, and it's interesting, as adults sometimes we read Grimm and we're like, yikes, like this part. But my friend Pauline Mert, who she is the foundress of a Montessori school in Denver. She says children in this the 6 to 12 age range, they're in this plane of development where those shocking, horrible things that we're a little nervous about sharing with children aren't so traumatizing or damaging. And in fact, a fairy tale is the perfect place for them to encounter those hard truths, because it's a safe sort of like intrigue into like the painful and the suffering.
Yes.
And then what happens at the end.
Well, and this is precisely where it should happen, because
in story.
Yes, and we have I know our school, all our teachers love our students and are good people. So that's the kind of environment you want your young people to encounter this. We don't want them to encounter it when they're 19 with a police officer. We want them to encounter it here, where people love them and are bringing the truths of cultures from thousands of years that have reflected on this.
So now, maybe before we talk about this, could we speak of the development of virtue in this context?
So I was going to you brought up the Grimm, the Grimm brothers. Yes. So in his book here, Mr. Guroian talks about how his life was changed by his encounter with the hard truths from the Grimm stories. He says his children became better readers and better writers because of that encounter. And then he goes on to talk about how children are vitally concerned with distinguishing good from evil and truth from falsehood, and how the fairy tales can be a great place to do this. Now, obviously, a lot of these come from 19th century Germany, but there's a longer history behind that. And of course, there's some pagan elements, of course. Mm-hmm. There's some Christian elements, and it's not perfect, like you were saying. None of this is perfect. Mm-hmm. But there is something about returning to to our roots in that area. And I thought it might be interesting. He brings up here the case of Beauty and the Beast. Mm-hmm. So I thought this might be our sample case. He says, the real Beauty and the Beast, not the Hollywood one. In that story, he says, the virtues glimmer as if in a looking glass. So did you want to share what happens in Beauty and the Beast?
Yeah, so I haven't read the original. Mm-hmm. I've read synopses of the 4 different versions.
Okay.
And what stands out to me in reading those synopses is that somehow in 1950s, was it the 1950s when Beauty and the Beast came out with Disney? Somehow there's just this complete misunderstanding of what Beauty and the Beast was about.
Yeah.
And it became a story about the transformation of a basically bad person into a good person through the influence of a beautiful woman who, had maybe no more sense than any other beautiful woman.
You know what? You summed that up really well. Yeah,
So,
right.
So when we're dealing with the
actual story,
I wouldn't even call the Disney version a true fairy tale, because it doesn't accomplish what a fairy tale should. If we want to find the true Beauty and the Beast, we need to look for that version that that recognizes the truth, beauty, and goodness within the characters themselves, and how that is borne out through their interactions.
So in the original tale, the Beast, he is beastly physically on the outside, but what's he like on the inside?
So he appears to be a virtuous person. His capture of Belle,
who is beautiful on the outside,
and also truly virtuous
on the inside,
unlike her sisters.
Right.
He captures her much in the same way that Belle is captured in the Disney version, but she's not a prisoner. When he captures her, he sets her up as mistress of the house, and he says, "I am your servant," which fundamentally changes their relationship.
Absolutely.
Whereas in the Disney version, she's kidnapped and has no freedom to really make any choice about who she would be in love
I think
with.
it shows how our culture struggles with nuance, different dynamics between men and women. It's either oppressor and victim, and that's it. We have no room for anything else.
It's interesting. So maybe you have read the original version. I'm not sure which version.
I haven't. I was just looking at what he says about it.
Well, it's interesting because what he says is, at the beginning of the story, we learn that a very rich merchant had 3 daughters. Oh yes, you're right. All of whom were extremely handsome, especially the youngest, so she was called the Little Beauty. But nothing more is said about the beauty's physical attributes. Instead, our attention is drawn to her virtuous character. Beauty's moral goodness, her inner beauty, is contrasted with her sister's pride, vanity, and selfishness, their inner ugliness.
And that's just something the new version doesn't draw our attention to.
They don't spend a lot of time on that, which is important.
In fact, I think. It's been a long time since I've seen the movie, but aren't her sisters kind of ugly?
Maybe they had to make them
for them to make their particular point, right?
Yeah, and something interesting. Well, maybe we can speak more about the story of Beauty and the Beast.
Well, what I mainly wanted to draw out, I think he said very well, is we had a new version that got rid of the fact that her virtue on the inside is what mattered. She's not a prisoner. And he says, this story depicts with a peculiar force the mystery of virtue itself. And I think that's so important because it is a mystery. It's not, there's so much nuance, there's so many different ways to approach it. I think the original story has all those different points that could appeal to a child's imagination. Instead, we just want to get rid of that, throw it into a Hollywood blockbuster, and of course in our culture capitalize on it and make some money. We have some products, that's what we do, and then we're just kind of left with a skeletal version of what's really happening, and I think denying the richness to our students.
I mean, I guess the movie version talks about this, but something I loved about how you chose Beauty and the Beast is because Beauty in this version, she exemplifies, I think, what we hope of our students here at the school, in particular her love for books. And so I thought that was so interesting that you ended up choosing this one.
I actually forgot about that, but that's a great. We'll just say that was providential.
Yeah, they made fun of her. They laughed at their youngest sister because she spent the greatest part of her time in reading good books.
Oh, I didn't know. I didn't remember that.
And
I love that.
I thought it was
because that
cool.
is something we can relate to over here at Holy Child.
Yes, that even in this story, they speak of the truth that can be gathered, that we are made to experience in reading books. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought up that point in an age where I meet so many people, and when I tell them our school believes in good books, they say, "You're crazy. We just need Chromebooks. That's it." And I say, "No, we believe in real books."
Mm-hmm.
And we spend a lot of our time with books at Holy Child. So speaking of books, is there something you'd like to close
little
with?
thing, yes. So we spoke a little bit about developing the child's moral imagination.
Yes.
And I think it's important. I mean, I'm doing in my classroom, I know Dylan is too, where what are the virtues? And we use that as kind of a litmus for characters and their attributes in the stories. But even if the story isn't perfect in highlighting virtue, I think it can still bring us back to, like, a good story can bring us to what we're made for as humans. So I think I'll end with the moment we talked about, so developing the moral imagination, but also fairy tales as a way to prepare the child for the Christian story. And so this is
said.
a little...
That's what we want to do.
A little paragraph, and if it needs explanation, if you could. But so this is Tolkien on his essay on fairy stories. It's not very long.
No.
So if you're listening to this podcast and you're intrigued by this, we really encourage you to read it. But this is in his epilogue, and he says, he's speaking of joy. "I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt-making creatures men in a way fitting to this aspect as to others of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful and moving, mythical in their perfect, self-contained significance. And among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable Eucatastrophe," which means good catastrophe.
I love that word.
Yeah, so Tolkien coined that word, which the essay explains more about. But
in our show notes, we'll write the word out.
we will, yes. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of sub-creation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the Eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the Eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true based on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of capital C creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath.
The inner consistency of reality. That is what we hope to bring, a glimmer of that to our students on Fairy Tale Friday, because deep down, if they see that in stories, there's something in them that knows, that truth is out there and will carry them and save them from that despair and that sadness.
Absolutely.
So thank you for sharing that. Thank you both for sharing such wonderful wisdom with us.
Thank
you for listening at our latest podcast of Raising Saints and Forming Scholars. We like to highlight our very own students here at Holy Child Catholic School. If you look at our video of the students singing Salve Regina and you keep on watching until the end, you will see our students dressed up for Fairy Tale Friday. At Holy Child, we take fairy tales seriously, but that doesn't mean we don't have a lot of fun.